1940s, New York City began to assert itself as the new center of the art world. This was accomplished largely by abstract expressionism, the first internationally practiced art movement born in America. While abstract expressionism is almost undoubtedly the most significant American art movement, there were domestic art movements in America before it. The Hudson River School, for instance, a group of American painters established in the 1820s, is typically considered the first definite, stylistically united movement of artists in America. They were influenced by the European Romantic painters, especially their notion of the sublime in nature. Following the Hudson River School, in the second half of the 19th century came tonalism, which took inspiration from a group of French realist painters, the Barbizon School. In the late 19th century, an American iteration of Impressionism was developed by painters such as William Merritt Chase, Childe Hassam, and John Singer Sargent, who traveled frequently to Europe, especially Paris, and absorbed the artistic sensibilities of the French Impressionists. Notably, all of these, the earliest American art movements, were essentially variations on styles which originated in Europe. For this reason, it might be said the first truly American art movement was the Ashcan School. The Ashcan School was a loosely defined group of American artists working at the turn of the century. The origins of the group are in Philadelphia towards the end of the 19th century, but they are best known for the works they produced later after moving to New York at the start of the 20th century. While the ranks of the Ashcan School were never strictly defined, Robert Henri is often considered to be the leading force of the movement, with some of the other most prominent members including John Sloan, George Bellows, Everett Shinn, George Lukes, and William Glackens. Most of the Ashcan artists were trained in America at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, where the foundational members of the movement met. Robert Henri had also studied in France from 1888 to 1891, during which time he came to appreciate Impressionism. However, Henri would contemptuously refer to the style as a, quote, new academicism by 1895. At this time, Impressionism was well established in America as well, with painters like William Merritt Chase among the most famous and highly regarded in the country. The rebellious spirit of the movement at its outset had vanished, as the Impressionists found mainstream acceptance redefined as an apparatus of the Academy whose narrow vision of art they had initially fought against. In Europe as well, at the end of the 19th century, there were new artistic styles developing. Neo-Impressionism and Post-Impressionism were the new grounds of artistic development and would soon give way to even more radical movements like Fauvism, Expressionism, and Cubism in the early 20th century. While these groups of European artists and the Ashcan artists were all developing alternatives to the Impressionism that preceded them, the challenges presented by each differed. All of these European movements could be described as art for art's sake. That is to say, the subject matter of their paintings is the very medium of painting. Though Matisse, Cezanne, and Braque painted still lifes and landscapes and nudes, they were generally uninterested in the specific things being represented. Rather, these subjects were chosen because they are conventional for the medium and do not distract from their real interest, their real subject matter, painting itself. Conversely, the Ashcan artists were pursuing, as Robert Henri put it, art for life's sake. The vision of the Ashcan School was an art that truly represented life as they saw it, not in the sense of being diligently and realistically rendered, but in the sense of possessing a real vitality and humanity. For this reason, Ashcan art is anomalous. Even as a modern art movement, it cannot be placed into the neat trajectory of increasing abstraction from the late 18th century to the mid-20th. Unlike the contemporaneous movements in Europe, Ashcan art was not simply another step towards fulfilling painting's turn inward, resulting eventually in pure, abstract, formal experimentation. Unlike the Fauves and post-impressionists, Ashcan artists did not work to fulfill the untethering of paint from literal representation. Perhaps the best way to understand Ashcan art is as a resolution of Impressionism and Realism into a cohesive whole. A redefinition of realism as a practice informed by the lessons of Impressionism. Gustave Courbet wrote in the Realist Manifesto of 1855, quote, "To know in order to do, that was my idea. To be in a position to translate the customs, the ideas, the appearance of my time according to my own estimation. To be not only a painter, but a man as well. In short, to create living art. This is my goal." Unquote. This, too, was the goal of the Ashcan school. This living art, however, was pursued not by plain likeness, as in the works of Courbet and the early French realists. Instead, for the Ashcan school, realism was discovered in tactility. In their paintings, visual demarcation of the subjects and scenes is dissolving. The often awkward, sprawling, impressionist-like spaces of cityscapes, interiors, and portraits on Ashcan canvases are veristic, to be sure, but not by typical means. In recognition of Impressionism's innovations, great attention is paid to the quality of light and mood in these pictures. This approach is exemplified in John Sloane's The Coffee Line, where the titular line of unemployed waiting for coffee in the early morning is nearly unrecognizable as such. Instead, Sloane is concerned with establishing a sense of place. Thick dabs of paint swirl at the bottom of the canvas, dirty snow matted on the city streets, reflecting the dim glow of the street lamps. The work of the Ashcan school proposes that an image which captures, if nothing else, the visceral response, is more essential and more real than a studied, diligently rendered space. So then, while the Ashcan school committed themselves to truthfully painting life around them, the rapidly brushed paintings communicate that truth primarily through immediate sensation and haptic appeal. Of course, there is more significance to Ashcan art than these purely formal issues. Recommitting to a recently outmoded philosophy, like realism, requires deliberation. The term Ashcan art originates from a comment derisively issued towards Robert Henry and his circle on account of their choice to paint and draw, quote, "pictures of ashcans and girls hitching up their skirts on Horatio Street," unquote. Unsanitized portrayal of the populace and new chaos of an industrialized city and the disregard for mediated beauty was radical. The care taken in painting such scenes, in seeing them as worthy of record, is a sort of veneration towards a life and class of people often unseen in art. In this sense, too, the Ashcan school carried forward the work of the French realists. Painters like Corot, Daumier, Caillebotte, and Millet commonly portrayed scenes of farmers and other laborers. While the motif of everyday life had carried forward into Impressionism, the range of lifestyle which was represented became largely restricted to the upper class. For Impressionism, more common subjects included women in lavish dress lounging or at their vanities, ballets, jockeys, boaters, and luncheons. This shift away from the subject of working people, which French critics had described as vulgar in the paintings of the realists, towards the depiction of a higher class lifestyle, which was certainly more comfortable scenery to the patrons of the arts, was reversed in the work of the Ashcan artists. Accepting this, what makes the subject matter of Ashcan art distinct from realism and urgent in its own time was the Industrial Revolution. The majority of the realists' work was done in the early stages of industrialization in France, and the mainstream was ceded to the Impressionists before the implications of that process were entirely clear. In the case of the Ashcan artists, working in New York at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th, industrial capitalism was already established. The lifestyle depicted by the French realists, though reflective of their surroundings at the time, was vanishing, replaced with the urban and industrial scenes of Ashcan art. To appreciate how this new reality was reflected in Ashcan art, we must return to a formal analysis. The truth of urban industrial life could not be communicated in the manner of the realists, with studied, thoroughly rendered and composed scenes. For the bedlam before them, the Ashcan artists painted loosely, impressionistically perhaps, but much rougher. This manner of painting resulted in scenes where, pictorially and metaphorically, persons are integrated with each other and their environments. Just as the conditions of industrial labor breed class consciousness and solidarity, the Ashcan school came to a painted collectivism. The bodies occupying Ashcan pictures are not so much persons as presences. Their movement is communicated with severe physical impact, while the individuals themselves are essentially unknowable apart from their participation in a collective, ambient sensation of presence. Consider how, in George Bellows' Stag at Sharkey's, the features of the boxers themselves are scarcely present. Instead, the focus is the muscular brushwork, reflecting the force of their motion. The only recognizable faces are minuscule, loose caricatures scattered in the crowd, which perform more as a suggestion of the great sea of persons than as representations of any particular individuals among them. Returning to Sloane's The Coffee Line, this formal collectivism becomes more obviously purposeful. Jobless workers stretch across the canvas, framed not as individuals, but again as a gathered presence. This is especially notable at a time when joblessness was, as it still is, commonly regarded as an issue of personal impropriety rather than a systemic failing. In Ashcan art, Whiteness and the Unspectacular Man, Alexis L. Boylan demonstrates that the anxiety over non-workers in America at the start of the 20th century was often expressed as a question about the individual's willingness to work. In this context, Sloane's choice to incorporate the crowd both as an undifferentiated group and a feature of the landscape is significant. The viewer is unable to address individuals. The collective cannot be picked apart visually, and liberal obsessions with personal virtue are not entertained. The socialist conclusion of the Ashcan school is implied by such representations, where subject and environment are integrated. Callous conditions for laborers are endemic in an urban capitalist landscape. As well as promoting a sense of collectivism, the painterly despecification of the individual is employed in Ashcan art to the end of suggesting the alienation of the laborer under capitalism. This effect is exemplified in George Bellows' series of paintings documenting the construction of Pennsylvania Station in New York City. Both Excavation at Night and Pennsylvania Station Excavation demonstrate the massive scale of the project by contrast with the workers carrying it out. Thin silhouettes, each one lacking in features and indistinct, but clearly separate from each other in space. any personhood evaporates amid the tumult of excavation, a scene of destruction which Bellows notably favors to the constructive action that will follow. Robert Henry's scenes of the industrial, such as derricks on the North River, boast a similar effect to Bellows. Of particular note is Henry's coal breaker. This view of a coal processing plant was painted during the anthracite coal strikes in 1902, hence the apparent stillness of the machinery. A few workers appear, nearly indistinguishable in a homogeneous muddy gray palette, on the pathway leading to the plant. Henry emphasizes the difficult, oppositional, and detached relationship of the workers to their workplace, an unfeeling colossus looming above. Many Ashcan artists were, personally, socialists. John Sloan, for instance, worked as an illustrator for the socialist magazine The Masses. Robert Henry was friendly with the anarchist philosopher Emma Goldman and painted her portrait. Even disregarding this context, looking just at the paintings, a clear socialist perspective is established in the work of the Ashcan artists. Foremost, it is this conscious integration of a socio-political project into the art of these painters and vice versa, which defines Ashcan art from the tide of modernist art. Further, it is what made Ashcan art ultimately incompatible with the next steps of modernism. In 1913, the Armory Show brought about 1,300 works of Cubist, Fauvist, Post-Impressionist, Expressionist, and otherwise modernist art from Europe to America in the first large-scale exhibition of its kind. Though a few Ashcan artists were actually involved in the show, their paintings were thought tame compared to the revelation of Duchamp, Matisse, and Brancusi. It was these champions of the European avant-garde and not the Ashcan painters who became foundational to the next half-century of American art. The question, then, is why did this happen? Why was Ashcan art, perhaps the first truly American art movement, so quickly discarded by the nation which birthed it? Clement Greenberg was almost certainly the single most important art critic of the 20th century. He was an early proponent of abstract expressionism and the related movements of color field painting and hard-edge abstraction. Furthermore, his 1939 essay, Avant-Garde and Kitsch, offers an indirect explanation for why Ashcan art was an evolutionary dead end. In this essay, Greenberg describes the rising division between what he has termed avant-garde and kitsch culture. The avant-garde, in Greenberg's estimation, is the result of a breakdown in the lines of communication between artists and their audience. It had emerged over the 19th and 20th centuries because it was a period of social and political turmoil at a large scale, which reordered and created new social bases for the consumption of art. Since artists could no longer rely on clear communication with a certain known audience, the avant-garde formed as an increasingly insular culture. Avant-garde artists began to create works more about examining the medium they were working in than attempting to reflect any social or political values. Hence, the tendency towards abstraction. Conversely, kitsch, Greenberg explains, is composed of highly commodified cultural products made to placate the new subjects of industrialization and urbanization. Quote, prior to this, the only market for formal culture as distinguished from folk culture had been among those who, in addition to being able to read and write, could command the leisure and comfort that always goes hand in hand with cultivation of some sort. This, until then, had been inextricably associated with literacy, but with the introduction of universal literacy, the ability to read and write became almost a minor skill, like driving a car, and it no longer served to distinguish an individual's cultural inclinations, since it was no longer the exclusive concomitant of refined tastes. So, these new subjects, the proletariat, now required a formal culture, but lacked the leisurely lifestyle that would make them amiable to difficult, ambitious art. Instead, they are treated to kitsch, an ersatz culture of works made for easy consumption to placate the masses. Kitsch art tends towards realism and representation, this type of work being much easier to digest because, as Greenberg states, there is no discontinuity between art and life, no need to accept a convention. Doesn't that talk of merging art and life recall Henry's desire, art for life's sake? Just as much as their medium, the Ashcan artists had invested themselves in the realities of urban life. For them, the subject matter was not a means to an end, but something worthy in its own right. In the original essay, Greenberg was referring to academic realism when he spoke of closing the gap between art and life, but I still think it highlights a difference in philosophy. The suggestion is that art is more kitsch the closer it bears to life because it can be consumed with less friction. I think Greenberg is largely correct about why this division occurred, and the arguments in his essay can be extrapolated to demonstrate why Ashcan art was sort of brushed aside and excluded from the developing avant-garde tradition. I do, however, take issue with Greenberg's apparent belief that this was the only path forward, and that no alternatives would be as sustainable for the preservation of real art under capitalism. Regarding the argument that representational art, and especially realism, are susceptible to kitschiness, I do agree. Despite that, Greenberg does not seem to account for the idea that the closeness to life is only one axis of what makes art susceptible to becoming kitsch. We should also consider the content of a kind of art when discussing this. In the case of the Ashcan school, their politics were markedly socialist, and thus at odds with American capitalist hegemony. As for the abstract avant-garde, Greenberg acknowledges its political inertness. Quote, "It is true that once the avant-garde had succeeded in detaching itself from society, it proceeded to turn around and repudiate revolutionary as well as bourgeois politics. The revolution was left inside society, a part of that welter of ideological struggle which art and poetry find so unpropitious as soon as it begins to involve those precious axiomatic beliefs upon which culture thus far has had to rest. Hence, it developed that the true and most important function of the avant-garde was not to experiment, but to find a path along which it would be possible to keep culture moving in the midst of ideological confusion and violence. Retiring from public altogether, the avant-garde poet or artist sought to maintain the high level of his art by both narrowing and raising it to the expression of an absolute, in which all relativities and contradictions would be either resolved or beside the point. Art for art's sake, and pure poetry appear, and subject matter or content becomes something to be avoided like a plague. It had been in search of the absolute that the avant-garde has arrived at abstract or non-objective art. In poetry too, the avant-garde poet or artist tries in effect to imitate God by creating something valid solely on its own terms. In the way nature itself is valid, in the way a landscape, not its picture, is aesthetically valid, something given, increate, independent of meanings, similars, or originals. Content is to be dissolved so completely into form that the work of art or literature cannot be reduced in whole or in part to anything not itself." Unquote. As Greenberg saw it, the only path forward for the avant-garde, and thus the preservation of a real artistic culture, was to abandon representation, and with it political thought. The fear was that if the avant-garde did not maintain its distance from society in this way, all culture would be eroded to the form of a political apparatus, as happened in Stalinist Russia and Nazi Germany. For artists invested in protecting culture from being co-opted for government interests, abstraction seemed a logical step forward. The Ashcan school and their art were not commodified and mechanistic as Greenberg defined Kitsch to be. More than that, the politics of their art were revolutionary. Despite that, the Ashcan school would be barred from participation in the developing avant-garde tradition not because of the nature of their politics, but because they engaged with politics at all. Still, placing the apolitical nature of the abstract avant-garde in contrast to the anti-capitalist politics of some Ashcan works, it would seem to me that the former would perform as much more agreeable to capital in thus generating and perpetuating the kitsch avant-garde division than the latter. Does the apolitical nature of the abstract avant-garde not prime it for the same eventual fate that made Greenberg wary of representation and realism? Is the governmental exploitation of this abstract avant-garde not at least equally possible? As it happened, the abstract artists emerging in America, championed by critics like Greenberg, had their art appropriated for government projects all the same. After its founding in 1947, the CIA would fund modernist art in the US throughout the Cold War. Though much of the American avant-garde was composed of leftists who had an oppositional relationship with the US government, especially during the voraciously anti-communist McCarthy era, American intelligence still recognized the utility that these artists could have for their project. In 1950, the CIA helped to establish and fund the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which in turn funded international exhibits of American abstract art and distributed awards to American abstract artists. CIA agent Donald Jameson later explained, quote, "It was recognized that abstract expressionism was the kind of art that made socialist realism look even more stylized and more rigid and confined than it was, and that relationship was exploited in some of the exhibitions. In a way, our understanding was helped because Moscow in those days was very vicious in its denunciation of any kind of nonconformity to its own very rigid patterns. And so, one could quite adequately and accurately reason that anything they criticized that much and that heavy-handedly was worth support one way or another. So, we can reject the idea that the political vector of art can be avoided by abstraction. Consciously steering the avant-garde away from everyday political life proved an unsatisfactory solution, as we see that even peak abstraction was weaponized in the Cold War by the American government. In deciding to pursue art that was not infused with a particular political perspective, the mid-century avant-garde merely made their work a tool for the most influential political actors around them. In retrospect, at least, the necessity of art's political functioning under our current conditions must be accepted. Perhaps this is the end state for any artistic pursuit in the predicament of capitalism. Greenberg rightly assesses that true socialism would be necessary in order to combat the material conditions which lead to the dichotomy of kitsch and avant-garde, and both of those have played out in favor of government and capital-approved hegemonic beliefs. The working class are generally positioned such that they will not choose to engage with difficult avant-garde art and will typically prefer kitsch. This is especially true if the avant-garde art is consciously not made for a general public, as was done in the pursuit of abstract art. Distinguishing, formalizing, and accelerating the separation of avant-garde and kitsch in this way exacerbates a cultural division, and the general public will develop an oppositional relationship to the avant-garde as something which they are denied by their class standing. The public is then left only with kitsch. Until the point of socialism, any talk of a real art for the masses is, Greenberg asserts, nothing but demagogy. There is certainly truth to this position, but that truth is not as absolute as Greenberg seems to believe. For a brief time at the turn of the century, Ashcan art demonstrated an alternative, an art which is able to remain in the public sphere by consciously rejecting the will of capital and government, rather than withdrawing and becoming indifferent to it. An art which accurately identifies the new social bases created by industrialization and urbanization and truthfully speaks to the experience of the subjects of those forces, instead of retreating within itself as the old social bases disappear. An art which considered a strategic engagement with kitsch or a repurposing of kitsch forms to preserve lines of communication, the breakdown of which results in the avant-garde. Because the avant-garde kitsch dichotomy is generated by real material divisions outside of itself, there were and are limits on the capacity for its resolution on cultural terms. Perhaps Ashcan art, or any similar movement, could never have found an impactful niche in a context marred by such divisions. However, it is also possible that something like Ashcan art could help manage the extent to which those material divisions burn into art, and the extent to which a working class is denied anything but the ersatz culture of kitsch. On its own terms, Ashcan art was a losing battle to be certain. That doesn't mean there was nothing to be gained in fighting it.